we are delighted to have Kathy Pegion. She's an associate professor and Williams Chair in Earth System Prediction on subseasonal timescales in the School of Meteorology at the University of Oklahoma. She got her PhD in climate dynamics from George Mason University, and then taught there for a while. And I was privileged enough to take her class there. 10 out of 10, take again. Currently in Oklahoma, she leads a research group specializing in subseasonal to seasonal predictability. Exploring the sources and limits of forecast skill on the weeks to month time scale and how we can apply those predictions to positively impact society. So she's going to be talking about predictability on subseasonal time scale in South America. So Kathy, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul, and thank you for inviting me, for hosting me. It's really always a great honor when somebody who was a student with you turns around and invites you to their institution after they graduate and move on. You get a chance to see what they're doing, and so that's really a great honor. And also thanks to Alexandra for handling all of my logistics. Really great, so I really appreciate it. So I'm going to talk about sources of predictability for subseasonal precipitation in South America. And I'll tell you when we get into this a little bit why I even focused on South America in the first place. But before that, I do want to acknowledge my collaborators, Emily Becker and Meg Kurtman. When you find those people who are your longtime collaborators and you always get to do fun projects with them, you've really found gold, right? And then I also want to acknowledge our system prediction working group from NCAR with some really great experiments that they've done that I've been able to leverage both in this work as well as many other projects. All right. So I like to assume that not everyone is familiar with subseasonal prediction. So if you are, it's okay. You can tune out. You've probably seen this figure a million times. But if you're not, I want to make sure that I orient you to what is subseasonal prediction in the first place and why do we care about it. So subseasonal prediction fits right here in this middle range between a weather prediction and our seasonal outlooks. And why it's kind of distinct, why we think of it separately or focus on it in a separate way, is because for weather prediction, fundamentally it's those initial conditions in the atmosphere that are bringing our predictability. And eventually, once that information is kind of run out, we've lost that predictability for weather prediction. And then for seasonal timescales, we tend to think of those interactions between the ocean and the atmosphere or the land and the atmosphere as bringing memory or information that kind of extends our range of predictability into the seasonal timescale. So kind of thinking of it as sort of a boundary condition or a couple problem, where that coupling and interaction gives us that source of predictability. Right here in the middle, we have this challenge where those initial conditions from the atmosphere have kind of mostly run out, or the information from those. And the impacts of, say, the ocean, which moves on a much slower time scale, hasn't really had enough time to have a big impact. So we're kind of sitting in this intermediate range between kind of an initial value problem and a boundary value problem. So this is a very challenging time scale to make predictions, to make skillful ones anyway. And basically, we have to think about many different sources of predictability kind of all coming together to give us skill on these timescales. And so there was a big community effort, probably on the order of about 12 years ago. People started really focusing on seeing if we could find ways to make useful predictions on these timescales. And I think I would say that we haven't fully achieved that. We're still working on it. But the focus is really this 2 to 4 weeks. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm picking 3 weeks to focus on, and I'll explain to you why in a minute. So we did this big project called Subseasonal Experiment, also now called Subseasonal Consortium. We changed our name, but like Twitter, everyone's going to continue to call us SubX. So if you see SubX or Subsea, same thing. And we have a whole bunch of different models who all ran a set of past forecasts over many years. And then we calculated the skill over all those forecasts. And I'm showing you here the skill for forecast out to 3 weeks. And I'm showing you temperature. And this is for every single one of those models that participated in SubX. This is for the multi-model ensemble, so if you put it together. And this is for a persistence forecast, it's just kind of a reference. And what you'll see for temperature is that most places around the globe have some skill. It varies, some have less, some have more, but you don't see a lot of the models, and especially when you put the multi-model ensemble, there is some skill. That's great for temperature. But I'm only showing you South America because the rest of the globe is empty, white, no skill. So I'm just zooming in on the only place in the globe that actually has any skill for precipitation at week 3. And that's this large part of Brazil that has skill. Nowhere else in the globe. And I'm focusing here on week 3 because week 4 really has no skill. Sometimes with subseasonal, people will lump week 3 and 4 together. Everything's going to be week 3 because that's the time scale at which there's actually skill on for subseasonal. So we've got this skill in Brazil. It's present in all the models, some a little more, some a little less, but all of the models have it. So where's it coming from? Why is there skill here in precipitation when there's no skill anywhere else in the globe? And so the focus of this study is to figure out where is this skill coming from. And why does that matter? It matters because where we have skill is at the very least a realized source of predictability, right? Somewhere, something was giving us that skill. So there's some physical mechanism that's giving us that skill. So we want to understand what gives us skill in the first place. And that's important because it builds trust. If we can explain to people why the model is doing a good job or why we can trust a particular forecast or a particular model, it helps to build trust in a type of forecast that's really challenging to build trust about because there's a huge amount of uncertainty. So being able to say something about why is helpful. So a quick primer on precipitation in South America. This is annual rainfall, and this comes from reviews, a review paper here that I was not involved in, but I do want to acknowledge the author. So this shows you the rainfall annually. So this is basically Amazon, where you expect to have a lot of rainfall, right? And this shows you seasonally the percent of total precipitation for different seasons. And the important thing to note here is that DJF, December, January, February, that is the wet season in South America. And that is because that is their month when their monsoon occurs. So that's really, we're going to focus a lot on DJF for this study because that is the wet season. So one of the main sources of precipitation variability in this region is the South American precipitation dipole. And this sets up because you get a convergence zone. This is showing you precip here, these sort of two different setups of that convergence zone. And so you get the South Atlantic convergence zone, and so that gives you precipitation in that particular region, wherever that convergence zone sets up. This is part of the South American monsoon system that you get this convergence zone. And so then you kind of get a dipole structure where you get lots of precip where the convergence zone is happening, and then you get dry or reduced precip either to the north or to the south, depending on how that sets up. So the South American precipitation dipole is the leading pattern of precipitation variability in this region, and particularly so in the monsoon season, December, January, February. So if I do an EOF analysis or principal component analysis, you can see that this is the leading pattern that I get on precipitation. You get this dipole pattern. So just want to remind you, this is the leading pattern of variability. Does not guarantee that it's the leading source of predictability, but it is the leading source of variability in this region. So, ENSO also impacts South American precip. And I did want to mention this, the South American dipole has variability on both subseasonal and interannual timescales. ENSO is a leading mode of variability on the interannual timescales. So you get, this is an example of during El Nino, so we have the warm SSTs in the Pacific Ocean. This is what precip anomalies look like in South America during an El Nino. If you flip the sign for La Nina of the SSTs, you generally flip the sign of the precip anomalies as well. So you can see that you get during El Nino dry precip anomalies here, but that doesn't, of course, then you get a little bit of wet down here, but that doesn't really match up so well with that region of skill. There's a little overlap, but not fully overlapping. And then the MJO, this is on subseasonal timescales, it has its impact. And I took some example figures here from this kind of review paper. And the key thing here is that the MJO is eastward propagating convection, large area of convection, in the Indian Western Pacific Ocean. And so this, if the blue and the orange are the OLR anomalies, and that's showing us where there's convection. So wherever you have the blue, that's the reduced OLR anomalies, that's showing you where you have enhanced convection. And so you can see that this is propagating eastward over about, and it does so over about a 30 to 60 day time scale. Corresponding with this is a circulation, and that circulation has to do with shifting areas of large-scale convergence and divergence. So of course, the areas where you have increased convection, you're going to have convergence at the surface, rising motion, divergence aloft, and then opposite for the other way around. And so we focus on NJO in kind of the area where the convection is most prominent, and so that's the Indian and Pacific Oceans. But there is a signal of that also over here in South America. And so you can see in these divergence and convergence contours, so the green being divergence at 850 and the purple convergence at 850, you can see that there is a large-scale divergence and convergence signal as well associated with the MJO. And that leads to changes in precipitation associated with the different phases of the MJO. So depending on where the MJO is, we can get differences in circulation that lead to reduced or enhanced precipitation. So this is on kind of subseasonal timescales. So we have the South American dipole, which has both subseasonal and interannual components. We have ENSO that's primarily interannual but can project onto subseasonal timescales. And we have the MJO, which is primarily subseasonal. So when we think about these possible physical mechanisms that could be sources of predictability, we'll go back to the main question, which is where is this subseasonal precipitation skill in Brazil coming from? And so I mentioned about timescales. So we're going to look into what timescales are in play. I mentioned season. We're going to double check what seasons are most important. We have a hint that it's the rainy season, but we'll double check on that. We're going to look at the different components that could be at play. So is it mostly atmosphere-driven, this predictability? Is it mostly ocean-driven or land? How are all these different components of the climate system playing into this predictability? And then finally, we're going to look at mechanisms and understand the role of the dipole, and so MJO or something else, which, spoiler alert, there's some other things going on. So I want to explain first a little about these reforecasts or hindcasts. So I mentioned that I was showing you skill from a whole set of reforecasts, also called hindcasts, from SubX. Reforecasts are, I like to call them time machine forecasts. We take today's model, we go in a time machine, and we go back in time, and we make a forecast as if we don't know anything about the future with today's model. So we can do that over many forecasts from the past, and we can accumulate a whole set of these reforecasts such that we can build up robust statistics about the skill of the model. And that's because we're doing it from the past, so everything's already happened. So we have verification of what's actually happened that we can compare with these reforecasts. As opposed to if I started today making forecasts, I'd have to wait a while until I had a whole suite of forecasts that I could come up with some robust statistics on the skill of the model. And so these are based on initial conditions. These are coupled models, coupled ocean, atmosphere, land models that get initialized with the atmosphere, the ocean, and the land state, and then run forward in time. And we've done that for many, many different past times to get this robust set of reforecasts. So coming back to that original picture, I'm showing you that skill again, just to remind you of where we had skill. And this is this region in large part of Brazil. And so I want to then understand that first part, which is the time scale aspect. And so I'm going to recalculate the skill by removing all of the interannual variability first. And so by doing that, I recalculate the skill, and then I can compare with that original skill and say what was the impact of the interannual variability. And so I'll show you some comparisons to make it easy to see with the previous picture, but you can see real quick that there are some models now that show absolutely no skill. So we've lost all skill in some models when we remove the interannual variability. To highlight that, I picked on the INSEP CFS V2. That is our operational seasonal prediction model that they also run for subseasonal as well. And you can see that with interannual variability, if the skill looked like this, without it, there is no significant skill. So this tells us that in this particular model, all of this skill was driven by interannual sources. Yep.
How did you remove the interannual variability?
So for each year, I take each DJF, just take the average of the DJF and remove that for each and every year separately. So I've taken a DJF climatology, removed it. Sorry, not climatology. DJF for each individual year is calculated, and then removed each individual year's DJF. And I got that idea from Paul because he did it in his dissertation. All right. But we have this other model, the INCAR CSM2, and this is the model that actually has the most skill coverage of all the models. When we remove the interannual variability in CSM2, we retain most of the skill. Where we lose the skill is in this region, which is where ENSO was showing to have the biggest impact. So we can kind of surmise that in this model, we kind of removed the ENSO component, but we still have some other source of predictability that's most likely coming from some subseasonal component, right? So maybe it's a dipole, maybe it's NJO, maybe it's something else. But we've removed this ENSO component, presumably by removing the interannual variability. We'll double check on that a little more later, but the hope is that you can remove ENSO by removing the interannual variability. So to narrow down the season that we're going to focus on, I picked DJF. You can see this is showing you the skill without interannual variability for each season. And you can see the skill is primarily dominated by DJF and September, October, November. I've also looked at this for September, October, November, but just for, it doesn't show a lot of difference in terms of what we find. So I'm going to focus here in this presentation on DJF, which is primarily the rainy season. All right, so we've narrowed it down to, seems like there's some subseasonal stuff going on as a source of predictability, at least in some of the models. And we're going to focus on the rainy season of December, January, February. So which components of the climate system are contributing most to the predictability is the next question we're going to look into. And then basically thinking about the role of the ocean, atmosphere, and the wind. So to look at this, we're going to use a set of reforecasts that were provided by NCAR. And so I've been showing you skill when I labeled it CSM2. I was showing you skill of their, what I'm calling here, control, or their standard set of subseasonal forecasts. They've just made subseasonal reforecasts. Nothing fancy was done, no weird experiments, just a standard set of reforecasts. And those standard set of reforecasts included initializing the atmosphere, the ocean, and the land. We can try to understand the role of these different components by using this other suite of forecasts that they have, where they have taken one of the components, in this case the atmosphere, and they've initialized the atmosphere with climatological initial conditions. So not real atmosphere initial conditions, but climatological, so we're still on Earth. But they've given the ocean initial conditions and land initial conditions to the model as the realistic ones. So we can kind of think that if we remove the role of the atmosphere initial conditions by setting it to climatology, and we compare the skill between the control and the atmosphere climo run, then we can get a sense of what the role of the atmosphere initial conditions would be. And so this is just an example from making the atmosphere climatology, but they have done every single component and every possible combination. So we can use these to help us understand what the role of different components are by comparing the skill between these different experiments with the control. But we have one challenge here. We're trying to get at what the role of different components are. And all we've done is set the initial conditions to climatology. The initial conditions of the atmosphere, that should be whatever the state of the atmosphere was at a particular time, have been influenced by the ocean and the land. And the same is true of those other initial conditions, right? So we're not fully isolating only the role of the atmosphere. We're isolating the role of the atmosphere initial conditions, or in each of these cases, only the initial conditions of the component. And this is an important distinction. We kind of have to change the question we're asking about the components, because in a coupled system, it is nearly impossible to fully decouple everything. So when I say later, I show you that the atmosphere initial conditions were really important, that does not mean that the ocean and land were not important. It just means that the atmosphere's initial conditions were the critical piece, right? So I'll go into that in more detail, but I want to make the clear distinction about the role of it, that we're only isolating the role of initial conditions of each component. So we can now look at the skill. This is my control, so this is without interannual variability, what you've been looking at before. And this is the skill of the different ones where we've made different components climatological initial conditions. And the important thing I'll highlight is that you can see that there are several here that do not have any skill once we've climoed some initial condition. The key thing these have in common, these are all ones in which the atmosphere initial conditions were set to climatology. In some cases, others were also. But if we set the atmosphere initial conditions to climatology, we lose all skill. You can see these ones that still have skill, they set the ocean or the land in different combinations to climatology. And we still have skill when we set those. So it's the atmosphere initial conditions that are most important. Initial conditions, just to remind you. So that's great and all. We now know that obviously, yes?
I'm confused by that last statement. It seems to me the atmosphere initial conditions give you the least predictability when you include them.
No, so it's the way it's worded, it gets
Okay.
confusing. So here, I'll give you the example here. This is climate-ocean. So we've set the ocean initial conditions to climatology, and we've kept the atmosphere and the land initial conditions realistic. So if the atmosphere initial conditions are realistic, then we still get skill.
Oh yeah, okay, I see. I
Make
had
sense?
reversed my head.
Yeah, it's taken me a long time to I'm not going to get it reversed myself. So yes, right? And so that's the case. Anytime the atmosphere initial conditions are set to climatology, we get maps that look like this that are basically like.
Okay, thanks, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. So that's great. We know that obviously there's an important atmospheric component to this predictability. Doesn't mean the ocean and land didn't play a role in setting those initial conditions, but obviously the atmosphere is important, right, since its initial conditions are important. But that doesn't really tell us anything about the processes, patterns, what is really going on that's contributing to this skill. So I'm going to use a tool called canonical correlation analysis. Anybody here ever done a maximum covariance analysis? Anyone ever done an EOF analysis? Anyone ever done a canonical correlation analysis besides Paul? All right. So the goal here is to find patterns in time series that are most strongly correlated between two time series, right? So we have the model forecast, and we have the verification data, and we want to find the patterns and time series that are most highly correlated. This is similar to EOF analysis, where you're trying to find maximum variance, or maximum covariance analysis, where you're trying to find maximum covariance between two patterns in time series, right? Two sets of data. So, but here, the thing we're trying to maximize is correlation. And so that's just like trying to maximize, you can think of it as skill, where I was doing skill in terms of correlation. So now I can decompose the skill into those patterns in time series in terms of the ordering of what pattern in time series was most skillful to least skillful. And this can help us to then try to start to get at some of these physical processes and understand what's going on. So this is the most predictable pattern from the CCA. from the model, and that's from the verification. So you can see they have there's some similarities, there's obviously some differences. Models aren't perfect, right? So we do have this dry area, we do have this wet area, but it's much weaker in the model than in the verification. The model's a bit smoother, that's probably resolution and ensemble averaging. But generally, you know, there's enough similarity to think that the model is picking up on something real.
Sorry, can you explain what you mean by?
Oh,
Can I ask one question? Yeah. Which model is it? Is it the entire
Sorry,
ensemble
it's-
or one single model?
this is CSM. I'm sorry. I should have made it very clear. I'm going forward with CSM as from the rest of the analysis. Thank you for asking.
And what do you mean by most predictable pattern?
So I used the canonical correlation to find the patterns that maximized correlation. So this would be the pattern the first one is the pattern that maximized the correlation between the model forecast and the observations.
Okay.
So that would be the most skillful pattern, most predictable pattern. That make sense? Yeah, so we have this most predictable pattern. And then we also have a second most predictable pattern. Again, it's clear that the model is picking up on something that is actually in the observations. This is just a statistical technique. We could have found patterns that it thinks are the most predictable, but they're actually not very predictable, right? So we want to understand, one, are these patterns really predictable, or are they just a statistical artifact? And then we want to try to use them, if they're useful, to then understand physical processes that lead to these patterns. So we'll first try to understand, are these predictable patterns, do they really have any skill, or are they just made up statistical artifacts? So what I'm showing you here is, we have this pattern, we have a time series, just like with EOS, you have a pattern and a time series. We have a time series associated with each of these patterns. We have a model time series and a verification time series, and that tells you about the amplitude of this pattern, right? And so the correlation between those two time series is what this is maximizing. So that's called your canonical correlation. And so the correlation between the two time series for that most predictable component is this teal dot here. And then for the second one, it's this teal dot here. So we can see that the first pattern is correlated between the model and the verification at about 0.5. And so for a week 3 forecast, that's not too bad. If I could get a lot of week 3 forecasts at 0.5, I would jump up and down. These X's here are a measure of statistical significance. The important part is just if the dot is above the X, corresponding X of the same color, that means that this is passing a significance test such that it's significantly different from 0. So this was from the CSM control simulation, or control reforecast. We can do the same thing for all of these different climate experiments. And so if we lose the correlation, it drops significantly, drops below the significance. When we climo a component, that means that pattern is not present in that particular set of reforecasts. So we've lost this predictable pattern if we see its correlation drop significantly. And so we'll look at each of these. So we can see here that when we climo the ocean, that means we still have the atmosphere and the land initial conditions. We still have pretty much the same correlations. In any of these cases where we climo the atmosphere, we drop below significance for those patterns, or very nearly so. So again, this reinforces that the most predictable pattern that we see in the control disappears when we use only climatological initial conditions for the atmosphere. So again, reinforcing the idea that the atmosphere is really important here. Atmosphere initial conditions are critical. So now let's try to understand these patterns. What physical processes are they representing? What mechanisms led to them? So the first question is, do these patterns represent any aspects of this South American precipitation dipole? So it could just be, this looks like a dipole pattern, maybe it's a dipole, the dipole, and that explains everything. So I'm showing you up here, up top, this is the pattern of the South American dipole identified through EOF analysis. Typical way it's done is the leading mode of variability, so that's what I'm showing you here. And these are the patterns from my most predictable and second most predictable patterns. And they are correlated with this pattern at 0.43 and 0.24. So that's telling us that some component of the dipole is playing a role here, but not everything. We can difference these patterns. So this is the dipole pattern minus that first component, and then the dipole pattern minus that second component. And the key thing to see here is there's stuff going on here that's not just the South American dipole precip pattern. So partially this predictability is coming from the South American precipitation dipole. Part of it is coming from somewhere else. And so basically the next question is, what are the other physical processes that are contributing to this predictability? So we can further understand what's going on during these different patterns, when these different patterns are occurring. We can take that time series and we can do a regression between other fields in that time series. And so what I'm showing you is a simultaneous regression with outgoing long wave radiation in the sort of focused on the Pacific here. This is the maritime continent. And this is showing you at the same time that this pattern is in a certain state, what does the OLR look like? So what this is telling us is that this pattern, at the same time as this pattern is occurring, we see enhanced convection in the maritime continent region. So that might make us think NJO. But if we do this regression as a lag, and we go back a week, and we go back a week before that, we can see that this is not propagating. So classic signature of MJO is eastward propagating convection. But what we're seeing here is convection that is not propagating. So I'm inclined to think that it's the MJO is not what's is not really related to this particular most predictable pattern. We can also take a look at some circulation features. So we're showing you here this lagged regression, same thing. This is simultaneous with the pattern. And so this is your 0 weeks, and that's a week before, and then 2 weeks before. And you can see that there's some hint of this wave train occurring here in all of these, pretty consistent throughout, a little bit changing in amplitude. But we have some sort of wave train pattern, Rossby wave train pattern that's set up. And that seems to be associated with this particular, most predictable pattern. One other thing I'm not showing you is I also did a regression with sea surface temperature anomalies to see if there was some residual of El Nino or some other SST anomalies that were going on. And I'm not showing you that regression because that map is blank. There are no, the SST anomalies are nearly 0. So no aspect of the SST anomalies seem to be playing a role in this particular pattern. So these Rossby wave trains are really curious. The question is, where are they coming from? They could be coming from locally from the precip here and then kind of circumnavigating the globe. They could be coming from here, from some of this convection in the Indo-Pacific region. That could be producing extratropical wave trains. There's really just no way to tell from doing just a regression analysis and looking at it this way. So where are these Rossby wave trains coming from? Before I go into that, I'll just point out that we have some similar results from the second most predictable pattern. We see Rossby wave trains again. We don't know where they're coming from. And so the next step in this analysis will be to try to diagnose where are those Rossby wave trains coming from. So how am I going to do that? I have a simple atmospheric model. It is T63 spectral, which is just short of 2 degrees, so very coarse resolution. It's got 26 vertical levels. It's nonlinear, baroclinic primitive equations. It has simplified dry physics, so there's really no moisture in this model. It's just dynamics. You can think of this as kind of a circa 2000 atmospheric model. So really old school, very simple, but it represents the dynamics, right? And we can, basically the way the model is set up is you have to give it a background state, and it gets sort of nudged towards that background state just enough that it doesn't run off into its own crazy world. And you can also give it heating from different times. And in this case, I'm showing you results from a control simulation where I just gave it the seasonal background state and the seasonal heating. And by heating, I mean the vertical heating associated with latent heat release. Like so, for example, where you might have convection you would expect there to be latent heat release at some, in the tropics. It would sort of be this sort of top-heavy profile of latent heating, where latent heating is being released to sort of higher up in the troposphere. In this case, I'm just, for the control run, I'm just giving it a climatological state of that heating. So there's no special anomalies. So this is just giving you basically, what does the model do in December, January, February? What does it look like? And so this is just to confirm. I'm showing a comparison of averages. Average over, it's a 720-day run. I dropped the first 100 days just for spin up. And this is just showing an average over those days. So this should look like climatology for December, January, February. And I'm showing you U200 and B200. And I'm comparing with ERA5 climatology, just to show you that the model is on Earth. That it's not out to lunch, it's not doing anything crazy. It's not perfect. It's a very simple model, right? But it represents the climatology in terms of upper level U and V pretty reasonably. So what we can do with this model is we can impose heating in different places and then see what is the dynamical Rossby wave response to that heating. So that can help us to then identify, could we have gotten waves from different places that could have reached South America? So I'll tell you a little more about how I'm going to do that. So from my canonical correlations, I did a regression of the precipitation. This is similar to that OLR regression. And you can see that we have precip here, positive precip anomalies, negative precip anomalies. So you can think of these as areas of strong heating. And then we can put that, put that in the vertical. We can set it up to be a top-heavy profile that would be appropriate for the tropics. And we can give that heating to the model and say, what's the Rossby wave response to that heating? So in that first canonical correlation, we had heating in the Indian Ocean Pacific area, and we had that local heating in the South America region where we had the precip. In that second component, we had an area of heating here in the Central Pacific, and we had an area here where the precip was in the canonical correlation. So I can give the model, set up for these experiments where I give the model all of the tropical heating from that first component, only the tropical heating, or only the heating in the Indian Ocean Pacific region, or only the heating in that South America region. And then I can do the same thing for these different regions from the second component. And so the question we're asking is, can Rossby waves generated by the heating that were identified from my CCA, can they reach South America? Again, not a perfect model. It's not going to match exactly. But can we generate wave traits that would have reached our region of interest? And so what I'm showing here is each experiment, and I'm subtracting off the control. So this shows you the response that you get from putting that heating in. So the difference between the control run, which should just look like climatology, you see the response associated with that heating. And this is V200. So this is, you should be able to see Rossby wave response if there is one. And so this is what happens when I use all heating in the tropics. This is what happens when I use only the Indian Ocean Pacific heating. And this is what happens when I use the heating in South America, the local heating. And so it's pretty clear that we can't get the Rossby waves that we were seeing from that local heating in South America. We can, however, get a majority of that response from the Indian Ocean Pacific region. So it seems that the Rossby waves associated with that first most predictable pattern seem to at least somewhat be coming, some of it is coming from the Indian Ocean Pacific region.
And your heating, what's your vertical profile heating? Is it just the same everywhere, or?
So it's set up to be in the, so it's a tropical heating profile. So it's top heavy. So you're going to get a maximum at about, I think it's at about like
It's just like a standard one and it's the same everywhere?
yeah, it's an idealized tropical heating profile. Yeah. Yeah, since all of these were tropically based, all of them were.
Yeah, there are regions in the tropics where it's not top heavy too.
Right, very, yeah. We did actually check, these are top heavy. All right, so for this most predictable component, we can conclude that the Indian Ocean Pacific is a source of Rossby waves to South America. For the second component, we can see that that Central Pacific heating is not producing any Rossby waves. And that the majority of our heating, majority of our Rossby wave response can be produced with this local heating in South America. So this is telling us that for this part, that local heating generates these Rossby waves and they appear to kind of go around the globe sort of thing. So we've got local heating is critical for that second component, and we've got Indian Ocean Pacific heating is what's critical for that first component. All right, so I'm going to try to sum this up. It's a lot of information. So our question, where is subseasonal precipitation skill in Brazil coming from? I focused here on the timescales, primarily that subseasonal part, that when we removed the interannual, we still had skill, at least in some of the models. So there's a subseasonal component. I broke down the seasons and identified December, January, February, and September, October, November as the most important seasons for skill. We focus here on DJF because that's the rainy season. We get very similar results when you look at September, October, November. We broke it down in terms of components to try to understand the role of the different components, and we had to focus on the initial conditions part. We found the atmosphere initial conditions are absolutely critical to this predictability. So that means some aspect of an atmospheric mechanism has to be playing a role. And then we found that it's not the mechanisms that are leading to this are not ENSO, not the MJO. These are things that people really thought were very much critically important in previous literature. But there's been some concern because despite the fact that there appeared to be physical links, when people tried to understand the relationship of skill during ENSO and MJO, some people found that there was skill, some people found there wasn't skill associated with the ENSO and the MJO in South America. And I think this helps to shed some light on that confusion because this OLR pattern is very much in a region where you would expect OLR anomalies from MJO and from ENSO. And so I think it was very easy to maybe think that this was related to ENSO or MJO, but it seems, from what I found, that it's not. We found the South American precipitation dipole is, of course, really important, and that's contributing to some of the predictability. And then we also found these Rossby wave trains coming from the Indian Ocean Pacific region are contributing to the predictability as well. So that summarizes the results from the study, so thank you very much. I know it's a lot of information, so I'm happy to answer questions. Oh, all you side. I saw 3 hands go up at one time, so.
Okay. Questions? Yeah, John.
Thanks, Kathy, really interesting. The South American dipole is discussed here as if it's a mechanism. And I don't quite understand that because this is not my field of expertise. So is there something underlying why there's a dipole that is actually the mechanism?
Yeah, so fundamentally, the dipole, I think of it as the variability of the South Atlantic convergence zone.
Okay, so that's another way to phrase it. Okay.
Yeah.
So the variability of the South Atlantic convergence zone is a mechanism that has a role to play in the 3-week predictability.
Yes.
Okay, all right, thanks. Appreciate that.
This is more of an interpretation question than anything. In the figure that you showed for the correlations when you vary the initial conditions based on atmosphere, ocean, and land, it appears that when you set ocean and land to climatology, you get slightly higher correlation. Would an interpretation of that be then that the models are not representing or are not interpreting the land and ocean initial conditions appropriately when they run these forecasts?
So I just want to make sure I understand the nature of your question. So you're asking about this one, or this one?
It was the figure you showed that had the teal and turquoise.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here, when we did ocean and land, you actually looks like it got a little bit of an increase.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in this model, it seems that there are issues with the land initial condition process that maybe the the land is not being initialized properly. So actually, climoing the land gets rid of an error. So, yeah, so I think I would interpret that as issues with the land initial conditions in this model.
Would you say the same thing about the ocean as well? The first two, is you just climb over the ocean. You
Yeah,
just
these-
as well.
These are really indistinguishable. They're not that different. They're so minuscule. I don't know who's next, sorry.
Have you, so this is really interesting, great talk. Have you considered the possibility of interference between, so like MJO and something else, or something along the lines of trying to understand like just what is that in the maritime continent? And my mind kind of goes to like the idea of interference, that it could be, could there be some interference between something else that's resulting in it being, I don't know, more stationary for a certain period of time, right? Because I mean, an MJO phase can last, a week or so, right? Usually not 2 weeks, right?
Right.
But I'm just wondering if like, if there's something that could make it within certain events, like more stationary or some sort of interference or something.
Yeah, it's a really
I
great
don't
question.
know.
I have not thought about it in that way. I have been really curious, why is this convection just sitting here? Like, what could it possibly be? But I think when you're getting there, I wouldn't be surprised if there is some interaction between INSO and NJO here, right? Like, that could be going on. Because this, convection and this is wormhole convection, basically, variability and wormhole, that could easily be some combination of this. So yeah, great idea.
I was going to ask a related question, which is, do you think this could be just like moisture anomalies that are sticking around over time and it takes, like they kind of get infected around but don't move very much?
Yeah, I guess the thing I was thinking is that for it to stick around that long, there's got to be a reason it's sticking around. Like, why would it, why would convection just sit there for 3 weeks without some reason, right? So I'm thinking there's got to be some mechanism that's making it
Well,
want
the
to
convection is there
persist.
because the moisture's there, but
Sure.
whether the moisture's
But it's the wormhole, so the moisture's kind of always there, right?
Well, if you look at like a map of just moisture moving around, like column integrated moisture, and you look at the time evolution of that, it kind of moves with the winds, right? And so if the winds are such that it's not moving around much. I mean, there's some subtleties to why that works
Right,
that,
right.
we're working on, but I mean, I'm wondering if you could just think of it in terms of like a moisture anomaly that's sticking around for a while for whatever other reasons, right?
Yeah, I just tend to think of this as a sort of large scale, like and it's something about its coherence and persistence makes me think there should be something more to it, I guess.
So I tried to do some very similar experiments like 7 years ago using some sort of climatological initial conditions for a longer time scale prediction, more seasonal, interannual. And we had weird results. And one thing we were always wondering was, does it make sense to use climatological as initial conditions? Because that's never a state that's actually observed. It's like an averaging stuff. And I was wondering, I don't think we ever came to a good answer, and I was just wondering if you had a perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one always has to be skeptical of when you play games with models, have you made it do something that's not what it really wants to do? But I like the idea of climatological from the perspective that it at least ensures we're still on Earth. And if we're, rather than just giving it some random state or some, zeroing out, it sort of at least guarantees that what the atmosphere is starting with makes sense for the season, right? But it's a fair question. I don't think I have a good sense of whether this, whether it's maybe doing something, I don't know. If whatever it's doing, it seems subtle because it still looks reasonable, right? And if you look at individual cases, it doesn't look like the model's gone crazy on us. But I don't think I have a clear answer to what you're asking.
Thank you very much for nice talk. I have more than one question, I think. I'm interested to a topic that is covering South America, and we like the latitude is near the Tanzania, like south and north. I'll follow up the question of Professor John Martin and where he asked about convergence, because is it caused by the intertropical convergence zone that IPCZ has its move from south to north and north to south? That's one thing. That's what is causing the South American dipole. I'm thinking of that, if that's the reason. And then I'm thinking also, when you didn't say the ENSO and NGO has influenced the season predictability, I don't know that's the I'm looking like ENSO most of the time it's peak during from the October, November, going to December, and it's like the phase it goes down as it goes to January and February. So if you just concentrate to December, January, and February, have you ever thought of thinking about the September, October, and November, since the ENSO prediction start from somewhere in November, yes, going forward, because we have this experience that near the equator there is all sorts of ITCZ, but as you go down, you have like the season rainfall goes from November towards February or March, and you have the one in model, you will not find a dipole. The dipole usually we have experience in the place where there is near the equator, especially over 15 and 10 south of the equator. So I'm looking at have you ever thought of that? And then the third thing on my question is like, okay, you are using the skills for SIMS. I don't know, is it, I don't know if I pronounce it very well.